Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to March's 2025 Human Resource Committee meeting. First of all, the fire evacuation procedure. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit is located at the side of this room. Exit through reception and meet in the War Memorial Park. The meeting is being webcast and will be available live on the internet later after the meeting. And use of the microphones, please can I remind everybody that in order to be heard clearly within the room and by those present and by those on the webcast, that you must speak directly into your microphone. The microphone stem can be moved so that it is close to your mouth as possible. And please switch your mobile phones off or to silent. Okay, thank you very much. Right, number one. Apologies for absence and substitutions. I've received apologies from Councillor Court, Katecha, Councillor Johnston and Councillor Golding. I don't think there's any others. I think that's everybody, isn't it? And are there any declarations of interest? Nope. Great. Three. Sorry? Oh, sorry.
Going to repeat what happened in the full council. Unison members on some of the executive committee for Unison, not regionally, not in the southeast region. So.
Thank you. Number three, are there any urgent matters? No. Good. Item number four, confirm the membership of the Joint Consultative Committee. Following the Human Resource Committee held on the 7th of October 24, Councillor Jenkins, Councillor Durrant confirmed they would like to be members of the JCC. So the JCC membership for the municipal year 24 to 25 is myself, the portfolio holder, Councillor Johnston, Councillor Jenkins and Councillor Durrant. Are the committee happy to confirm the JCC membership for the municipal year 24 to 25? A bit late now. Everyone? Thank you. Item number 5, the minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of October. I assume you've all had a chance to read them. And for those who were here, are you happy to confirm an accurate record where only the accuracy is relevant? I wasn't there, so. Yeah. You were there. You were there. Yeah. I was there. Turned off. Item number 6, the Pay and Benefits Review Update. This report provides an update on the progress of the Council's Pay and Benefits Review since the previous HR Committee on the 7th of October 24. Contact officer is Sarah Cragg and Louise Stoner is to introduce the report. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. For committee members I've not yet had the chance to meet with, my name is Louise Stoner and I'm the HR Manager. So this report provides an interim update on phase 2 of the Pay and Benefits Review. The background detail as to why the Council embarked on a pay and benefits review is clearly stated as set out in section 2 of the report, and it was also covered in October's committee. Section 2.3 of the report confirms the items that are in scope of the review, which include the salaries for apprentice roles, business mileage rates and essential users, overtime, standby and call-out payments and arrangements across the Council for working outside of standard hours, any other payments received outside of basic pay, and a contractual review tendering process for the Council's benefits providers. So just a bit of an interim update. Lots of work has been progressed in relation to each strand of the review, and the proposals are currently with the leadership team who have posed some further additional feedback for the team to follow up on. The next stage will be to communicate the proposals out to staff, and I welcome any questions arising from this report.
Does anybody have any questions? Or any debate? I think, well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for a very comprehensive report, and and to move that the committee note the report. Yes, I make sure I'm on the right one. Note the report on the progress of phase 2 of the pay and benefits reviews. Everybody agreed? Agreed. Great. Right. On to item number 7, the gender pay gap report. And this report updates the committee on the council's gender pay gap and the details of how the council will fulfil its statutory obligations to report this information. Again, the contact officer Sarah Cragg and Louise Stoner to introduce the report. So once again, Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So the report tonight is asking for committee to note the reports on the council's gender pay gap. This is an annual report and we have a statutory requirement to publish this information. Gender pay gap is a valuable tool for assessing levels of equality in the workplace, female and male participation, and how effective talent is being maximised. The council is required under legislation to publish information relating to the relative pay gap between male and female employees, and in line with other employees who have a headcount of 250 or more employees. So they must comply with the regulation to publish both this information on the employer's website and on the Government Equalities Office website. The gender pay gap shows the difference between the average mean or median earnings of men and women, which is expressed as a percentage of men's earnings. Example, women earn 15% less than men. In total, there are 6 calculations to carry out as outlined in the report section 3.3, and we have an obligation to make sure that this is uploaded into the government website by the end of March this year. So the key headlines to share: overall, the council is in a good position, with the vast majority of the organisations having a larger pay gap. The mean gender pay gap for the whole economy in April 2024 is 13.8%, which is compared to the council's mean gender pay gap of minus 12.5% in favour of women. So this does compare favourably with that of other organisations. And the median gender pay gap for the whole economy is 13.1% as April 2024. And the council's median gender pay gap for 2024 is minus 20%, and this is in favour of women and compares favourably with that of other organisations. Another aspect that we're required to report on is also relates to the mean and median bonus gender pay gap. Although we don't pay bonuses as such, honorariums have a performance element, so they do need to be declared alongside long service awards. And as highlighted in the report, the bonus mean gender pay gap was minus 5% in favour of women in 2024, and the median bonus gender pay gap was 16% in favour of men in 2024. There is only 27 employees during the period that we report on that actually received an honorarium payment or long service award. So it's small numbers of employees that actually are eligible for this. And as such, that can actually skew the results. So just to summarise, the council's overall position, in a good position when benchmarking with the gender pay gap of other organisations, and it does reflect the council's aspiration to be a fair and inclusive employer. Welcome any feedback or questions regarding this report.
Anybody have any questions at all? No? Everybody happy? Okay, very good. All right. Okay, in that case, are the committee happy to note the report on the council's gender pay gap? Agreed? Great. And item number 8, the HR Operations and Workforce Information Update. The report sets out key people indicators and management information to the end of the third quarter of 24-25 and make comparisons with previous years' performance where applicable. The contact officer is Sarah Cragg, and this time Sarah Cragg is going to introduce the report. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, committee. And again, for those of you who I've not met before, my name is Sarah Cragg and I'm our Head of Human Resources and Organisational Development at the Council. So this, for those of you that have been on the committee before, is our sort of bumper report of all sorts of people metrics across the organisation. So I will just do a quick summary, but obviously very happy to take any questions on any aspects when we've concluded. So just sort of taking it section by section really, in terms of the first part of the report that looks at our workforce demographics and general workforce information. So most of this is largely static in relation to key demographic information, and you'll note that the report draws comparisons with the census data for the borough around a number of these areas. Really across those sections, the main area of change is our headcount as an organisation, which has increased from last year's 23-24 figures for the first 3 quarters of this current year. So you'll note in section 4.1 a sort of increase in that headcount across the last few years, specifically within those last couple of years. Turnover rate has continued to reduce from the 21-22, 22-23 years when it was a little higher, and it is projected to be below last year's figures by the end of March, so that kind of outturn figure is predicted to be lower again this year. And you'll note in the report we do cut that data in a number of different ways, looking at leavers by reason, by service area, length of service and grade, and that really just enables us to make sure that there's no particular areas of concern or note that we should be particularly focusing on. In terms of sickness absence, this continues to run ahead of the council's target, but you will note in the report that it does outline that we have 55% of the workforce who have had no recorded sickness absence in the year so far. And also you'll note, moving on into that section in terms of the reasons for the sickness, anxiety, stress and depression is our highest reason for sickness absence. Again, that's very much in line with wider societal trends, as has been the case for a number of years, as outlined in the linked CIPD report. And the council has a huge range of both proactive and reactive support measures, which I'll cover and which are covered later in the report. In terms of recruitment equality monitoring, so this is really just included to show the demographic information of applicants who've applied for roles within the council. Again, that just enables us to keep track of the pool of applicants that we're drawing in and whether there are particular areas that we need to focus on. In terms of promoting health and wellbeing, as I mentioned, the report does outline the council's provision of ongoing support, and that includes through things like our 24/7 employee assistance programme, which can not only offer telephone counselling but offers a range of other advice and support, debt advice, legal advice, etc. We also have an occupational health service that again can be used both when individuals are absent due to sickness, but also if there are any other health concerns in the course of someone's employment. We also have a number of staff trained as mental health champions who again can act as an alternative source of support and signposting for staff as and when may be appropriate. The report also covers a number of activities which have taken place and are planned to take place within our ongoing programme of health and wellbeing events for staff that sort of underpin that ongoing support which is always available. In relation to learning and development, just like the health and wellbeing work, this is really key within the council, and the report outlines our important work both with apprenticeships for specific apprentice roles, but also the use of apprenticeships for upskilling existing staff, as well as the employability work that's been undertaken and planned with local schools and colleges. So again, helping to promote the organisation as an employer and also supporting the wider community. Finally, the report talks about our organisational development activity, so that provides an update in relation to our new council values and the process of embedding those across the organisation, and a reminder, I suppose, of how they were developed. It also talks about some ongoing work programmes that we have, both in terms of starting to review the learning and development offer for staff as well as managers and leaders, and it also talks about the review of the recruitment and selection process that we've commenced, again trying to make sure that the values are weaved into that process, but also making sure that we work to be an attractive employer of choice within the local community and beyond. So that was it in terms of my summary, but as always, happy to take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Councillor West?
Hi, thank you for that. It's really helpful to break down those numbers and work out what is going on. I think you alluded to us being behind target on the absences and stuff. I was wondering, obviously, I mean, some of the numbers to me as the layman, and you've probably spent years looking at this kind of data and understanding it, to me as the layman, a lot of these numbers are relatively shocking. We're losing thousands of working days to various sickness and absence. And then in terms of planned welfare going forward, it didn't feel like there was lots there that was tangible to how we might be trying to lead on that to get to claw that back. I just wondered what you could talk about, plans for how we're doing that, and obviously this is not an isolated case for our council. It's the same for councils up and down the country. The LGA and councils have reported on this constantly, that our sector leads on this stuff. So I'm keen for us to try and be leading on how councils can tackle that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. There's a couple of bits I would say in response to that. I think firstly, in terms of the target, so the 6.5 days is a very stringent target. It's been the case for the 5.5 years that I've been here, and I think predating me as well, that has been the target for that time. What we have seen nationally is sickness absence trends generally increasing across sectors. So actually we've had a relatively challenging target, which has continued to be sort of challenging and kept the same during that time. So I guess by way of comparison, the most recent CIPD report, which admittedly was towards the end of 2023, talked about average number of work days lost as being about 7.8, and that's across public and private sector, whereas public sector it was averaging over 10 days. So in that wider context, our sort of benchmarking is still positive in terms of the levels of sickness that we have. That's not to say that we don't want to do more in terms of supporting staff. So there's a couple of bits around that. So the ongoing support is something we use very actively. So things like occupational health, it's not about getting staff back to work if they're not well enough to be so, but it's about making sure that we remove any potential barriers, making sure we're linking up with colleagues in the NHS to get that specialist medical support around anything else that we need to do to support staff. Another piece of work that we're currently working on is some sickness absence management training for our managers within the organisation. That's not to say that I don't think sickness is being managed, because I think it is, but it's always useful to have a refresher and an update in terms of the best practice around how we do this, how we have some of those difficult conversations, because they're not always easy conversations to have, and making sure that managers are aware of the full range of support that is available for staff. So that's something that we're piloting in the next few weeks. So I think we are always looking at what additional things we can do to kind of bolster that regular offer, because things like the EAP and the OH service are really important.
Okay. Councillor Abraham.
Yeah, thank you for, I echo what my colleague have said about the details I've provided in this report. I have a couple of questions. First one, there was a sort of a breakdown of the voluntary resignation, but overall turnover, and the projected percentage seems to be relatively lower than the previous year, I think from 10 into 6. So what sort of, I would be interested to know what sort of criteria did you base that on to project that there would be a drop off in the turnover? That's first question. The second, I really like the breakdown based on gender, disability, ethnicity, but I would be in the future perhaps interested to see that in the wider context of the breakdown of the population in Basingstoke. So it's kind of, when we say, 4% are people who declared they are people with disability, so how much actually of our population, if that's even possible, have a disability? So we know whether we actually reaching out to different groups and encourage them to apply, and the process is sort of accessible, if you like, for both, especially people with disabilities and minority groups. And a last question, I might not relate to this directly, but you can decide on that. It's great to see the gender pay gap is actually it's in favour, and there is a great progress on that. Do we have a similar policy for ethnicity pay gap and disability pay gap as well, or not? Thank you.
Apologies, I'm just making sure I capture all of those so I don't so I don't miss any. So please do correct me as I go through if I've misunderstood anything that you've said. Okay, so in terms of starting with turnover, so that's section 4.3, if anyone's picking that out. So there's two sets of turnover that we report. In terms of the organisational corporate key performance indicators that go to Cabinet and Resources Committee, we do tend to report on voluntary resignation. The reason why that one specifically is chosen is because that's the one that in theory we should have most influence over. So if that is running at a particularly high level, that's the one that in theory we could make changes to impact. The total labour turnover rate therefore includes all of that, but also the things that aren't voluntary. So that could be redundancies, although that's much less common here. That could be dismissals, that could be ending fixed term contract, that could be somebody whose visa's expired, a whole range of different things. But that's why we have the two rates, and that's why I think both are useful. The one that we do tend to focus more on, though, is that sort of voluntary resignation turnover rate. I think turnover is a really interesting one, and we've sort of talked before at this committee around that, because there is almost an optimum level of turnover, because actually it's not that we don't want good people to leave, but also bringing people into the organisation brings new ideas and knowledge and experience, and you recognise that people also often will move into other roles elsewhere and potentially come back to the organisation. So a level of turnover I think is helpful, but you don't want that to run too high. In terms of projecting forward, that is really difficult. So turnover is a little bit like sickness. It can be really difficult to predict what's going to happen quarter to quarter. So I think the figures you've got in the right-hand column there are what has happened so far at the point of writing the report up until December. We've then taken, I guess, an educated view around what might happen in that last quarter. There absolutely is the potential that could be slightly higher or lower, but I think we tend to base on previous years what quarter four looks like and do a sort of educated estimate, because I think that's all you can do with something like that, because there can be a whole range of reasons why people might leave the organisation. So in terms of the demographic data and the comparison to our local population, I think we do try and do some of that in the narrative by talking about the census comparisons, but I think we can have a look at whether there's a better way of presenting that so that it's easy to see what those census comparators are, because I think some of them are really positive. So for example, if we look at section 3.6, we're saying that the ethnicity of our employees being predominantly white British, which is just over 71% of our workforce, but actually the local census is that 88.5% of borough residents identify their ethnic group within the white category. So actually we're more diverse than the local population. So that is in there, but I recognise we could probably put it in a table and make that easier to see. So yeah, absolutely take that on board, and we can have a look at that for next time. I will take the gender pay gap one, but jump in if you want to, Louise. So yes, gender pay gap's really useful for us. Again, just to pick up on your point in terms of it being in favour of women, obviously that's really positive, but clearly we do also keep an eye on those figures. I think part of that is because in the lower quartile of staff it's predominantly male, so I think that potentially, and we do have more women in the upper quartile, so again that potentially is why that's the way our gender pay gap looks, but we do still keep an eye on that. And absolutely in terms of ethnicity and disability, they can be quite challenging because the government hasn't yet, and that's been going on for a number of years, looked at how that would be reported. So there are a number of different ways that you can do it. So I think it is something that we have continued to look at, and that is the intention of something that we do want to do. But I think it's looking at the best way to report that so it actually makes sense, because the male-female categories are quite straightforward, whereas there are so many different ways that you can cut, especially the ethnicity one. It's about how you make meaningful data, because when the numbers get very, very small, it almost becomes meaningless. So how do you do it in a way that's meaningful? So that is something we are still looking at, and absolutely something that's within our quality plan to do.
Councillor Jenkins.
Thank you. The CIPD, who are the CIPD, please?
Apologies, I should have clarified. So that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So that's essentially the professional body for HR people.
Thank you. And my second question would be, so obviously since the report's been published, we've learned about all of the governmental changes to the local government and all the reorganisation and exciting things that are going to be happening. How are we going to bake into the report? Because obviously anxiety and woes about jobs will be something that is going to happen to people who work here. no matter what reassurance we give them that, you know, it won't. I think anyone who has ever been through an acquisition will be worried. So how much in the next report are we going to focus on kind of the can't think of the word, sorry, the forecast for that, and is there any way that we can bake in something to the HR function to reassure people and make sure we don't lose the cream of the crop over the next few years? Thank you.
Thank you, and again, thank you for your question. I think it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously this is something that's very high profile in the press and a lot of people are talking about it. The reality is, by the time we get to the committee in October, we still won't have a decision in terms of what the future will actually look like in terms of where we will sit as a council. So there is sort of a lot of activity, and then, you know, full business case in September, and then a number of months when that is then considered by national government. So we will have a protracted period of time before we actually know for definite what that future looks like. Certainly we can look at how we build into the report a summary of what's being done to support staff and to reassure staff. And again, I'd like to think that we are being on the front foot with that. So we've recently done some staff briefings where our chief exec and deputy chief exec spent over an hour and a half for both briefings going through 100 odd questions that staff had submitted about all aspects of it, some of which we knew the answers to, some of which we don't yet, but just trying to provide that level of reassurance as much as we can in terms of what's happening. The projections of what that might do in terms of turnover and sickness absence is very, very difficult. Obviously, there are some other councils that have gone through similar processes, but again, that's not necessarily something that's sort of very openly, I guess, publicised in terms of some of those impacts. So we will look at what information is out there, but I think for us it's about keeping that dialogue open with staff on an ongoing basis, looking at keeping that comms very frequent and using the forums we have, whether that's our engagement with Unison, our staff forum, our staff briefings, to kind of keep that ear to the ground as to what's worrying staff, and then to address those as much as we can. Because again, you know, our chief exec was really clear in those briefings that we don't want to lose people. We absolutely want to retain staff, and we want to provide as much information as we can, as often as we can. But it is 3 years away, and obviously that message that we've still got lots of things we want to do now for our residents and for our staff. So it's that interesting middle ground that we're in. But yes, more than happy to look at how we can feed in as much as we can into the report for next time.
Councillor West.
My apologies, it's sort of kind of jumping back to the previous report, but only because something you said sparked a question, and I just want to get a point of clarity. So you said that you think that the gender pay gap stuff is possibly skewed by the fact that we've got a larger male workforce in some of the manual labour parts of the council's operation, which I imagine what you were alluding to is things like a park team that sort out waste in parks and things like that. And then that skews the data. Is there any way that in future reports we can look at sort of breaking that down a bit so that we can see department to department what the differences are? Because obviously that then read of the data then is quite important for us to then go, well, actually, is this true because you've averaged it, or is it true because men are in a lower paid position and women are in the top positions, but there isn't as many women, there isn't as many men. So it's just, I think that breakdown of the data would be helpful just for future committees.
Again, thank you for your question. So I think there's certainly some more information that we can provide. So we do, when we're producing the gender pay gap information, look at quartiles, for example. So we have the quartiles, so the grouping of salary ranges, if you like, for male and female. We don't tend to break that down to sort of departmental or service level in terms of what that looks like, partly because that's not, I guess, a requirement of what they're looking at nationally. And I think there's always challenges in certain areas where there are predominantly many more men than women, or vice versa, that again you start to get down to individual information. So we just need to be a little bit careful around what we can do. Certainly we can definitely provide the quartile information, because that's something that I've got in front of me now, which is where I drew that from, but we can have a look at what else we can provide. And I think that's, well, by using that example, I suppose that's not me necessarily suggesting that the information is or the results are skewed in that respect, i.e. that's the only reason why the gender pay gap is as it is for us, but I just think it's one of the contributing factors. But absolutely, we can look at what else we can provide to give some more context around that.
Okay, are there any more questions? No. Right. Okay, in that case, are the committee happy to note the report presented to as per the council's constitution? Agreed? Okay, thanks. I think any more questions on previous ones, perhaps they can go for the works programme. Okay, thank you. Okay, agenda item number 9, the pay policy statement for 25 and 26. This report sets out the council's pay policy statement for 25 and 26. The contact officer is Sarah Craig, and Sarah again to introduce the report. Goes.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the report of our proposed pay policy statement for 2025-26. So under our constitution, this is something that comes to the Human Resources Committee to then hopefully approve for recommendation to full council. And in line with the Localism Act, it is full council that then approves this, and we do have to have a pay policy statement in place under that act. So the Localism Act really sets out a whole range of things in section 2.5 of the report that we have to include in the pay policy statement, and really what sits underneath that is the need to have transparency in terms of local authorities around how our pay structure is devised. So specific salaries for senior roles is reported separately as part of our accounts process. So this is really more around the structure of how we determine pay within the organisation. So this is something that comes on an annual basis, and we are required to publish and make available on our website. So largely it is based on the previous pay policy statement. So when we did phase 1 of the pay and benefits review, there were a number of changes to our pay structure, including introducing a new job evaluation system and new pay structure. So there were some quite significant updates made at that point, but there's very few changes proposed for this year compared to the one previously. So most of the updates are either around updated salary figures or updated job roles, and that includes some changes to some of the approval routes, because some of the previous roles in there are not roles that we still have within our structure. The other thing that the pay policy statement talks about is our pay ratio. So that's really looking at the gap between the highest paid employee and the median salary at the council. Again, that's something that we're required to report, and it's set out how that should be calculated. So again, our pay ratio remains low and actually has decreased again from last year's pay policy statement. So that gap between the top role and the median role again has reduced slightly. The only other thing to make the committee aware is we haven't yet had a national pay award offer for 2025-2026. So despite having introduced our own pay structure, we have still committed to follow the nationally negotiated salary awards that are made between unions and employers' body nationally. That's not been agreed for the coming year. So that will be implemented as and when that is agreed, and there is the delegated authority that sits within my role to make those amendments as a result of any national pay awards, which again is still within our contract to agree. Potentially there may be some changes to the pay policy statement as a result of the second phase of the pay and benefits review, but as Louise alluded to earlier on, we're still in the process of going through that review and yet to consult with staff. So if there are changes that are required, then we would of course bring that back to an HR committee for that to be considered. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, are there any questions? No. Wonderful. Okay, so the recommendation for the committee here is to, 1, recommend the pay policy statement at Appendix 1 to the Council. Is everyone agreed? Agreed. Great. And 2, note the existing delegation to the Head of Human Resources and Organisational Development to update the pay policy statement as a result of any pay awards which the Council is contractually bound to agree. Agreed? Thank you. Okay, and on to item number 10, the updated human resource policy. The HR committee are requested to review and approve the updated policy review schedule and to review and approve the minor amendments to the disability and accessibility policy and grievance policy and procedure. The HR committee are constitutionally required to undertake an annual review, of the delegation to officers to agree all other employment policies not explicitly listed on page 3.5 in section 265, paragraph 3 of the Constitution, determining whether the committee wishes to amend the delegation for any certain policies. Contact Officer Sarah Cragg and Louise Stoner to introduce the report. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Chair. So there's 3 recommendations to committee. The first is to review and approve the updated policy review schedule as outlined in section 2.6. Just wanted to point out it is section 2.6, not section 2.4. Section 2.5 on page 59 of the committee report. And the second part, as in per the agenda, there has been an amendment to recommendation 2. So just to provide some context, Unison have submitted some additional comments and feedback on the policies, but they've requested further time to consider the policies. So the policies are for, just to confirm, the disability and accessibility policy and the grievance policy and procedure. So approval would be sought based on no further comments received from Unison, so approval as they are in this pack, or to delegate the authority to the head of HR and OD to amend minor revisions from Unison and then circulate the amended policies to the committee for information, or if there are any major revisions received from Unison to the relevant policies, they're to be brought back to the HR committee for review and approval. So that's the second part. And then the third part tonight is to seek views from the committee as to whether you recommend there to be any amendments to the delegation to officer for certain policies not listed in section 2.1. A list of the additional policies can be found on page 91 of the actual pack of the agenda. So just to confirm, HR policies are reviewed on an ongoing basis, and policies may be reviewed at more regular interviews due to new ways of work, statutory changes, procedure or process changes. Minor revisions have been made to the policies, so the disability and accessibility policy and the grievance policy, which have all been outlined in the report. And the proposed revisions to these policies have been discussed with local representatives of the council's recognised trade union, Unison. So just to go through the actual policies, as listed, it is the disability and accessibility policy and grievance policy and procedure. Section 3 lists all the revisions that are being proposed to make to the disability and accessibility policy, and as you can see, a lot of it is terminology and just grammatical corrections. And then on section 4, the grievance policy and procedures, we've set out all the key revisions, including the reason for the revisions as well on that policy. So they're clearly stated, and also in track changes, all the revisions proposed. So I welcome any comments or feedback from committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor West.
Thank you for that. The grievance policy on 10.3, adding that where an employee wants to be accompanied at an informal stage, it will not unreasonably be refused. Changed from it will not be refused. It says here, this allows for all possible situations. Just interested as to why it needs to be changed to from it will not be refused, which feels more concrete, to it will not be unreasonably refused, which feels a little more vague and down for interpretation.
Sorry, can you repeat where that was?
Of course, yes. It's
Thank you.
Point.
What page on the agenda?
Thank you for pointing that out. So just to confirm, so that is a proposal in the wording, stating that at the informal stage, you wouldn't always have a member of staff who would be accompanied at a meeting. So it's really just saying that it would not unreasonably be refused, changed it from it would not be refused. So it's just allowing for all situations that may arise in relation to that.
And I think just to add to that, I think that's partly off the basis of some previous conversations that we've also had with Unison around the capability policy. So typically we wouldn't have an individual represented at an informal process, because the point of an informal process is it is informal. So you don't have a rep, you don't have HR attending. It's a sort of extension of the management conversation. So I think from a management side, I think previously we've talked with Unison colleagues about not having that within the policies. Understandably, they had some concerns around that. So I think where we were meeting in the middle was kind of saying we will leave it in the policy, but we were saying it won't be unreasonably refused, recognising that actually there may be occasions where we may feel as an organisation that it is inappropriate for someone to be represented at that informal stage because it is informal, and obviously all of our policies have a number of stages with that sort of formal representation. So it was sort of a halfway house that we came to when talking about this in other policies. So I think it was something that we were keen to sort of mirror in this one, recognising that Unison were very keen that option to be represented stayed within the policy.
Thank you. Councillor Ibrahim.
Thank you. Just to follow up on this again, reading it throughout. And I understand your point about the early stages. You don't wanna sort of, it might as well be resolved at that early stage with no staff accompanied. But then on the other hand, I think it's sort of a takeaway, a sort of empowerment, if you like, for employees if they are in a situation where it's really challenging and they might need to be accompanied for for well-being reason, or for whatever other reason they might need, and then I think it just kind of tone it down a little bit, and usage of unreasonably might mean you can basically give the council more power, if you like, to say no, and that means that individual going through such a very difficult process unaccompanied, which might impact even their decision to take that and challenge, for example, if there's an issue as a council, because they might feel like that it's overwhelming, it's too much. And so I think the point I want to make again, just to support what Councillor West have said, is the current wording seems to be more empowering to employees and actually encouraging to raise issue and being able to have the support they need at the early stage. And I wouldn't underestimate, if anything, that the very informal early stage is one of the most challenging and difficult stages. So I sort of second Councillor West's suggestion, or the point he made on this, and whether we can keep the wording as is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to particularly have an issue with that if that's something that we feel you feel very strongly about as a committee. I think that's fine. Yeah, I do stand by the fact that we wouldn't unreasonably refuse anyone to be sort of represented at that informal stage. I think there is always the risk that does sort of then make things more formal, because then not unreasonably the manager says, would it be helpful to have HR there? And then you take the conversation to somewhere else. But having said that, we have allowed individuals to be represented previously. I think it's helpful clarification. But as I say, if it's something the committee feel very strongly about, I'm content to leave the wording as it is.
Councillor Darrant.
I'd be happy to leave the wording as is now proposed, to be honest. Unreasonably, I think it's fine. I think it gives the option.
Councillor West?
Sorry, I know that we're talking about getting to consensus. Just a final note. On this, I know that you're saying you're working through some of the Unison comments on this stuff, and that you're expecting more comments. Do you have any? Obviously, you said you'd gone back and forth on some of this already. Where are they currently at? If you know at the moment, or if you don't, then please, it would be good to get that information before we get anywhere on this.
So just to be clear in terms of the comments that I was saying, so Unison and I had some conversations in relation to the capability policy around that being represented at informal stages. So we haven't had a comment specifically from them about that wording. So the comments that we have had so far, both from Unison at a regional and a local level, have already been incorporated, and we agreed with all the amendments that they have made so far, and they're all part of those track changes. But there was a suggestion from them locally that they may have some more comments. There was an individual who wasn't around who may want to make further comments, so we would just want to allow those other comments to come through. So it may be that they don't have any further comments to make, but because they'd made the request, we wanted to give them the time to do that, because we recognise that both of these are really important policies for staff and therefore obviously for Unison as well.
Councillor Abraham?
Yeah, perhaps just to help us move this along, I'm considering proposing that, because I know the amendment recommendation is still waiting on further comments from Unison. So perhaps if, while you're following up on this, that you point this out to them and say this, which sort of wording you think would work best in the interest of the employees. And whatever they come back with, perhaps that could be taken as, you don't need to come back to us as a committee, and you kind of take their feedback or input on boards if that would sort it. So basically referring it to Unison rather than us trying to vote into different sides of things.
Is the rest of the committee happy with that suggestion? Okay, agreed. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, lost track where we are now. Right. So in that case, so the recommendation for this one is then that we have reviewed and approved the updated policy, reviewed the schedule to ensure that these can be timed across the scheduled committees as outlined in section 2.6 of the report. Agreed? Thank you. And review and approve the following updated policy: disability and accessibility policy, grievance policy and procedure with those amendments. Yep, agreed? And finally, I think 3 views of the committee are sought on 2 of 12, whether the HR committee wish to recommend there to be any amendments to the delegations to officers, which we've pretty much, I think, covered there, for certain employment policies not listed in section 2.1 of this report, as outlined in section 2.2 of this report. Is everybody agreed? Thank you. Right. On to item number 11, review of the work programme. The committee is asked to note and review the work programme. Sarah Cragg to introduce it. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. So the next Human Resources Committee is scheduled for the beginning of October, so the 6th of October 2025. And we do tend to have certain reports that go to the October committee. So what's on the work programme are our standard reports. So the HR Workforce Update Report, which is the one with all the data, because under the Constitution that comes to every HR committee. We then will have another 2 policies scheduled to be reviewed, along with an updated staff code of conduct. So there'll be 3 documents proposed to come to the next committee. There's an annual review of health and safety, again as part of the Constitution, that comes to the Human Resources Committee on an annual basis, and similarly our termination cost report, which also comes to the committee on an annual basis in line with the Constitution. So they're currently everything on the work programme. depending on where we are with pay and benefits phase 2 by that point, it may be that is also something that we need to consider. And again, depending on whether anything has changed in relation to local government reorganisation, obviously we would put that through to yourselves. But as it stands, that's everything sort of proposed.
Is everybody agreed with that? Lovely. Thank you very much. Right, there's nothing else on the agenda there. So in that case, I call the meeting to a close. Thank you very much for attending. Thanks. And thank you very much for some very comprehensive reports there, both of you.